how we can learn from past disasters to try and prevent new ones. Over to Brian.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for logging in. Tonight's presentation, as Brian has said, is about disaster prevention. Hopefully you can see the first slide, disasters. Essentially, we're considering disaster prevention on the when we remember one of the worst disasters in history, the World Wars. Critically, when you look at this information, or when we consider this information, consider that we're doing it retrospectively, without the controls and political situations that existed when the disasters occurred. The objective is to try and establish why predictable disasters occurred. And there will be two specific examples of significant disasters that could have been prevented. I've actually used artificial intelligence significantly on this presentation. All the pictures that you see are being developed by Copilot, and the photographs are my own photographs. So AI can help, but when I was carrying out the presentation, AI did somewhat mislead and at times referred me back to my own presentation. However, one big advantage of AI is that it is completely without distractions faced by humans. It doesn't have to worry what it's going to do tomorrow, whether it's going to get paid. It's not that intelligence yet. The case for learning from disasters. History is an efficient and effective way of learning, but frequently people don't bother to take the easy way out. Confucius in the 5th century said it is better to learn by imitation, which is the easiest. And the third is bitter when you actually repeat disasters that could have been avoided. Isaac Newton in 1675 also said that he learned by standing on the shoulders of others. I think Einstein also gave credit to those that went before him. During the preparation, I came across Frank Knight, who distinguished between the difference between risk and uncertainty. Risk is where you might be able to estimate the outcome, but uncertainty when you have no ability to know what is unknowable. In some of the disasters that have occurred, the knowable became unknowable and hence the disaster. One of the key areas that we need to control when we want to prevent disasters is manage the barriers. Frequently, some organizations actually remove the barriers and head full on into a disaster. Another key issue is negative reporting, and we will discuss negative reporting further in the talk. I acknowledge that very little of this talk is my own contribution. Essentially, I've used Copilot, I've used government resources, I've used inquiries. The only glue that I've added is my own personal experience. Critically, the presentation, I could say, started in 2003 when I read the article on predictable disasters. Until I read that article, it never occurred to me that disasters were predictable. Subsequently, the Harvard Business Review in March 2006 advised of the hidden traps in decision-making. The hidden traps in decision-making exist today and will exist tomorrow and the day after. One of the people I turned to in my career was Trevor Kletz and the Institute of Chemical Engineers. Some of today's engineers might not have heard him, but as we go into the talk, you can see how significant Kletz was in influencing disaster prevention. This is a photograph of the Shell Brent Spar that was used to unload crude oil from the production platforms. On the 29th of July 1990, it suffered a fatal helicopter crash. The helicopter in the picture essentially tried to land on the helideck. It should not have been a difficult landing. However, during the landing, the helicopter reversed into the crane that you can see in the photograph, crashed onto the helideck, then toppled into the sea. Quite a significant crash, but 3 people survived. The 3 people that survived because their seats had been reinforced after a previous helicopter crash, showing that in some cases, lessons have been learned from disasters. Disaster may or may not be present in your industry. For example, in the oil and gas industry, where large amounts of hydrocarbon are used, the disaster is just around the corner. So disaster prevention was a priority. The one thing that frequently took place was emergency exercises to simulate a disaster and see whether the teams could actually accommodate them and recover from them. In order to learn effectively from disasters, the knowledge must be internalized in practice and standards, otherwise it's forgotten. When I started this presentation, or when I put the presentation together, many of the lessons that I'd learned had been forgotten, and the presentation reminded me again of the lessons. Organizations failed to develop competence that threaten their survival. That can happen because any organization is overwhelmed at times with a lack of resources and sometimes a lack of finance. Intellectual competence has been developed for centuries. One of the most amazing books I read was Marcus Aurelius, who was talking about how he managed the Roman Empire. And his discussion on change showed that change was a problem since even Marcus Aurelius. Leonardo da Vinci also gave another concept. He said that painting the body was easy, painting the mind was difficult. That suggested to me that the organization might have a mind, or what is best described as a culture. The culture of the organization can either aid or prevent a disaster. Fortunately, today we've got unlimited instant access to centuries of intellectual capital. However, as I demonstrated myself, when you actually look for this information, you have to be familiar and understand when you can be misled. Sometimes artificial intelligence actually declares that it might give you the wrong answer. In one case, a positive was given a negative response by AI. Today, unfortunately, even though disasters have occurred almost since mankind began, today's organizations still retain the dependable ability for disaster repetition. How can we break the chain? This looks a calm, clear situation. In order to think clearly, you need to be in such an environment. Unfortunately, it doesn't exist in many organizations. But the mind needs to try and recognize decision noise and biases if it wants to identify the predictable disaster. The decision noise and bias will be discussed in later slide. Critically, for Grenfell Tower and other disasters, there's a breach of regulations. Regulations are one of the things that need to be considered diligently if disasters are to be avoided. One of my guiding principles given when I started to be involved in the design of offshore platforms was, whatever else you do, make sure you comply with the law. Mitigation of why disasters occur is in item 2. Tomorrow is overwhelmed by today. This is probably quite a controversial statement, but it's one I found popping up frequently in my career. There can sometimes be negligible benefit for the individual when he seeks to prevent a disaster. Few people would prepare to challenge Kublai Khan when he tried to invade Japan. The ships that he used for the invasion were totally unsuitable, and the invasion against Japan failed. Critically to the talk is the Grenfell Tower disaster, an absolute catastrophe that could have been avoided. Organizations developed a total blindness to the disaster preconditions and almost smashed through them. Another key, as well as regulatory failure, is outsourcing safety. Safety is a core competence and should be retained within the organization. The complications of outsourcing safety will be explained shortly. Why replicate disasters? Why would anybody want to spend money on something that they can't predict? The money spent on prevention is precisely measured. The value gained is very difficult to establish. So frequently one can understand that the minimal level of energy is achieved by just ignoring the future disaster. This is a classic example of how disasters occur. Again, the picture of the ferry is generated by Copilot. The bow doors are not visible from the bridge, yet unless the bow doors are closed, then the ferry might sink, and in this case it did. So why not fit bow status lights to confirm the status of the bow doors? The captains wanted it, the company didn't because of cost. I think the cost was in the region somewhere of £600. Because the bow door closing light status lights were not fitted, a ferry sailed on the 6th of March 1987 with the bow doors open. As a result, 193 people died. This was a control system that was developed at the time for the organization I was working for. It's quite complicated, so I'll explain briefly what happened. The assistant boatswain was supposed to close the bow doors. Unfortunately, he fell asleep. The captain should have asked for confirmation that the bow doors had been closed. He didn't. So basically, the ship sailed, as explained in the previous slide, and capsized. The captain, of course, subsequently was criticised for the fact that he didn't ask if the bows had been closed. He should have asked for positive reporting, not assume that they had been closed. We don't have to travel far to find significant risks. This is a photograph taken in Farnham, the town where I live. There's a lady walking on the footpath where the concrete ballast on that tower crane is suspended. It also would engage the park traffic were it to have fell. The pedestrian was unaware. When I tried to alert the local authority, it wasn't interested. It tried to pass it back to the builder. There was no contact number for builder, so eventually I gave up. This is one of the critical issues, outsourcing disasters by outsourcing key safety information, where the management outsource it and then don't have the time to check the integrity of the information that's provided to them. Platts quoted Tweedale from 1993. Tweedale referred to outsourcing like a student hiring somebody to attend a course and sit the examination because they're too busy or incompetent. So the examiner hires someone to set and mark their exam papers. This is a situation that has existed with safety cases and currently exists in many situations of environmental impact assessments. Essentially, the law is circumvented. Let's further consider that continuous risk prevention problems is the victims are not known in advance. He says that there's no limit to the resources spent to rescue a child trapped in a disused well. Who would argue to leave them there? But not everyone, there's a lot of argument against putting the railings to prevent the child falling in the well in the first place. This is an important point, so I'll leave the slide for a few seconds so that the situation can be reviewed and understood. This, to me, is one of the major problems why disasters occur: outsourcing. Core competence should remain within the organisation. At one time, the Health and Safety Executive required that safety cases were produced by the organisation itself. Disaster causes, probably many are familiar with a number of these issues. The uninformed client is one of the key problems. I once asked a consultant who said he liked working for me, why? He said, because you know what you want. There's frequently missing accountability, noise and bias, loss of integrity, which is critical to the two disasters that we are going to consider shortly. And I've even seen sabotage create a disaster where a large hole was drilled in a crude oil storage tank. Eventually, the Epcot lining gave way and the crude oil leaked out into a stream and eventually into the sea. Breached regulations. There's insufficient enforcement expenditure. This again will become apparent when we look at the Grenfell Tower disaster. On many projects, the successful projects, the cost and the delivery date are not underestimated. On many public sector projects, 9 out of 10 are over budget and the delivery date lost or not achieved. Capital savings in design ignore the consequential operational risks. However, if the client is the operator, then the design team have to answer to the operator. One of the reasons why designs are late and over budget is there's no design freeze. Changes take place during the construction. The later the change in any project, the more expensive it becomes. This is a photograph taken on Mont Blanc mountain in France, and it identifies why look for problems. When I saw this cloud approaching the mountain, I was somewhat concerned that there would be a rush to descend the mountain, and I didn't particularly want to spend unnecessary time in a cafe covered by cloud. So we managed to move off the mountain in time and drank beer in Chamonix instead. So the key for critical activities, ask. The Grenfell disaster, what a disaster. A perfect lesson of everything that could go wrong, went wrong. There's some uninformed clients apart from the client. Knowns became unknowns. Building regulations either unknown or ignored. The cost changes to save money were taken without risk assessment. There was a complete breach of the legal obligation to preserve building fire integrity. Surprisingly, in 1889, the Grenfell Tower was built with no fatalities. Gustav Eiffel was a brilliant project manager. He actually considered safety all those years ago, using screens, guardrails, safety netting, which protected the workers from falling. Unfortunately, there was one fatality when one of the workers showed his girlfriend the Eiffel Tower. He unfortunately fell and killed himself. Decision noise. I only became familiar with decision noise a few years ago when I read Kleinman's book on decision noise. Decision noise causes judgment inconsistency. This occurs when the same competent professionals, given the same advice, given the same information, come to different decisions. There are a number of reasons why. Some of it is down to bias. This information was gained from a large research in the United States, some which involved judgments by judges that should have delivered the same sentences. Enforced regulation can reduce both noise and bias because regulation does limit discretion to fail. Organizations infrequently evaluate decision quality. When an organization has made a decision or completed a project, very few organizations, if any, look to see if the better decision could have been made. Sorry, this is sorry about that. Continuing the theme of regulatory failure, these apply to the Grenfell Tower especially, and perhaps to the Concorde disaster. In terms of resources, this is a universal problem faced by, I think, most organizations. Quoted in the Grenfell Tower was, I believe, a comment from a minister. It had become increasingly, or a civil servant, one either or, it had become increasingly difficult to oversee the building regulations because of the reduction of number of staff and the changes involved in deregulation. The reference is provided there specifically so that it can be validated. Now, in Grenfell, there were many opportunities to break the cascade of failures, yet few were activated. The principal contractor and regulator should have assessed and outsourced management, but I doubt if, having read the inquiry, I doubt if that was the case. Fortunately for us that fly, the aviation industry benefits from a much stricter regulation and disaster compliance. Airworthy certificates can be withdrawn. We're faced with psychological barriers. Frequently, you might want to believe things are better than they really are. There's a bias to change one's mind. There's a failure to manage and understand embedded risk in the organization. It only becomes apparent when things go wrong. There's comfort in not doing much, especially if overwhelmed with other problems. There's frequently an avoidance to consider future risk. However, one doesn't control the external environment. It's vital to understand the increase in hostile environment, especially politics, if politics have an impact on your operations. Our organizational barrier, there may be a lack of interest. I worked for one company where they'd frequently just avoided a major disaster, which certainly perked up the interest in avoiding the next disaster. I'm sure many are familiar with the dispersed responsibility, and it is critical that there's direct accountability in any situation if you want to try and make sure it's successful. The other critical thing that happens in organizations is the departments fragment and filter information flow. The filtered information removes sensitive or embarrassing information. There's an example of this as regards to information flowing to the Housing Minister in the Grenfell inquiry. The open door policy can reveal critical problems. I worked for a company where the open door policy was that everybody left their doors open, welcoming someone to give negative feedback. It's something that is essential, that you can welcome negative feedback. Because if people don't think that they can bring their problems, then they stop bringing them, and disasters will lie hidden. I mentioned political barriers previously. There's decision disruptors, people who just don't want to change or want a comfortable life. However, there's departmental status and survival, who wants their department to be axed. There's also self-survival and self-serving bias of employees, who wants to be made redundant or demoted or have a pay freeze. Here we have the management system disaster process. Started with information filters. Then we have data information corruption, which should be recognized by professional competence. If it's not, we have decision noise, followed by decision bias, culture, and then a fatal decision that leads to disaster. Learning from past disasters, another local disaster where lorries kept hitting a bridge because they were too tall and overturning. I was surprised to see how many bridge hits there were. It is quite clear from the disaster, if you had been driving a car in the opposite direction to this lorry, it overturning would not have been a happy event. Not all risks are this transparent, but for the climber, hopefully knows what he's doing. I just thought it was a good indication of how risk can actually be transparent. This is again a co-pilot generated picture of an aircraft carrier for those who've not seen them, and there's no reason why many should have seen an aircraft carrier. Britain only has 2. This was my first experience of preventing risks. During the maintenance period, HMS Ark Royal was undergoing a refit, and I was advised that there was a danger in maintaining the steam drain system for the boiler room. However, I didn't take that advice and insisted that the fire system was overhauled. Fortunately, the boiler room fire was quenched by the refitted steam drain system. The one thing that was noticed when you actually prevented disaster or contribute to preventing it, there was not much awareness or acknowledgement of how the disaster was avoided, but there would have been clear accountability if the system had failed. Going back to Grenfell Tower, this again is another co-pilot generation. So why did the disaster occur? Who created it? And how did they create it? How did they create it? Sorry. There was noise and bias. There was regulatory failure. There's absence of safety management, defective project management of capital and operational risk with the consequences. There was data, knowledge, and intelligence deficiencies. Who? Virtually everybody was to blame. The government, failure to enforce regulation, the construction industry standards were found lacking. The London Fire Brigade, they had inadequate fire measure and building management precautions. The Grenfell modification breached the regulations and design integrity. The project management team were unaware of the design risks. Any one of those could have provided a barrier. The London Fire Brigade could admit could have mitigated the number of fatalities. Unfortunately, it wasn't in a position to do so. The Grenfell Tower inquiry. I was surprised to learn that any inquiry doesn't apportion blame or determine who. However, it should make recommendations to prevent disaster repetition. For Grenfell, understandably, there was 58 recommendations, which the government accepted them all, fortunately. However, the speed at which these recommendations are implemented leaves a lot to be desired. Considering the number of fatalities, there's yet to be any prosecutions of negligence or even gross negligence. The Grenfell Tower inquiry deviated somewhat in that it did consider blame because of the blatant disregard of the fire regulations. I will leave you to read item 2, which clearly states that the fire should have not occurred if the walls had been fitted with cladding that did not propagate the fire. Somewhat disappointed in response from the London Fire Brigade. They'd had experience of previous high-rise building fires and didn't seem to learn from them. They were significantly criticised by the inquiry. The planning was inadequate. The fire commanders had knowledge but insufficient training of the dangers associated with the combustible cladding. People were told to stay in the building, whereas those that survived ignored the advice. It only had one escape route, which I found quite surprising for a high-rise building. Companies that I've worked for have demanded in any accommodation that their employees worked, there was at least 2 escape routes. It was a red line that you couldn't occupy a building with 1 escape route. There was no contingency plan for the evacuation of Grenfell Tower, which again surprised me. When you consider the risk involved in all those number of people, especially some of whom might be disabled, elderly, trying to escape around 1 escape route, there should be contingency planning. Basic information was missing, so the system that should have worked didn't work. The inquiry recommendations naturally insisted that the removal of the polythene cores were removed. However, this is a major cost problem and is going to take some time. I believe the cost of the recommendations runs into billions. The government, as I said, accepted all 58 recommendations. It would be very difficult for them actually to oppose them, considering the disaster and the consequences and the lack of barriers and lack of controls. The government talked about and accepted the need for a single regulator, but the regulator is only effective if they're given adequate resources. The definition of a high-risk building for the purposes of the Building Safety Act needs to be reviewed. Again, I would have thought, this is a personal opinion, that a high-rise building should be considered a major accident site. Let's go to the Concord inquiry, which is another example of inquiries. It was the Concorde that crashed was operated by Air France, and the inquiry was carried out by the US, by France, in accordance with this Convention on International Aviation, which means that every air crash needs to be thoroughly investigated because the aircraft concerned might be in a number of fleets, aircraft fleets throughout the world. There's also a EU law which the French naturally complied with. The inquiry again repeated that the sole objective was to draw lessons which can help future accidents or incidents. This again is another co-pilot diagram or a photograph or simulation. Concorde was a frontier technical project, and it was the first successful supersonic aircraft, beating both Russia and the United States into providing a supersonic passenger aircraft. Unfortunately, had uncontrollable expenditure and high political risk. Concorde was a joint venture between the UK and France. Both had slightly different agendas. At one time, the UK wanted to abandon the project, but France insisted that it continued. What happened with Concorde? Essentially, during takeoff, a tyre ruptured when passing over a strip of metal which had fallen from the previous aircraft. Debris was thrown against the wing, which eventually ruptured fuel tank 5. Fuel tank 5 was not penetrated initially by the tyre debris, but it set up a pressure wave inside the tank, which ruptured. When the tank ruptured, essentially a major fire broke out under the wing. The landing gear would not retract, albeit that this was not significant because the aircraft had no chance of landing. The aircraft flew around for a minute at speed and then crashed into a hotel. I believe the Air France paid out 100 million in compensation to the passengers, so it was not a cheap crash, but a devastatingly fatal one. Thinking about the project, the Concorde fuel tank was vulnerable to tyre rupture and debris. It had a takeoff speed of 400 kilometers per hour, which is fast. If it hits anything, the debris hits the tank or hits the aircraft at significant speed. The debris on the runway that the Concorde hit was operated by, had fallen from the DC-10 operated by Continental. This had taken off 5 minutes before Concorde. Unfortunately, the runway was not checked for debris, which I believe was standard practice, which was understandable when the aircraft was such a vulnerable aircraft to debris on the runway. Doing research, it is not clear, but there were a number of operational tyre bursts prior to the fatal accident that did not end in disaster. So was the risk underestimated? It's difficult to know. So what changed for this flight that actually caused such a catastrophic disaster? So was it preventable? The fuel tank vulnerability was known and at risk from debris. The emergency regulator directive modifications indicated that that was a known defect, or potentially should have been a known defect. The modification also required reinforcement of the landing gear because the landing gear was taken out. Had the aircraft survived, it might have been able to land. The fuel tanks were 2 millimeters thick, which is quite thin. Because there were two jurisdictions involved, the US Federal Aviation Authority also carried out its own DC-10 investigation. The DC-10 was not regarded as a critical repair, so the repair did not return the aircraft to its original integrity. However, the US Federal Aviation lessons is that aircraft should now be returned to their original integrity. This is a universal applicable lesson. For example, in planning regulations for the local authority or the plan, it says that all modifications should be of similar integrity or use similar materials. When you change or you degrade any system, care and caution needs to be taken to understand the consequences. Prevention management, this is probably quite a strict comparison between the two systems, the one where the management can cause a disaster and one where they hopefully can prevent the disaster. Environmental insensitivity, which includes political pressures. Most organizations have to be, and probably cost-driven, whereas value-driven will help prevent the next disaster. Short-term vision, long-term, those are self-evident. The organizational culture, some organizations have a culture which puts safety at an important level. Hopefully that is within the aircraft industry. However, recent events at Boeing suggest that organizational culture is critical to preventing disasters. The management can be overconfident, whether rational competence is required to expend what you need to prevent the disaster. The management is biased and competent management is unbiased. So the conclusions. Legal obligations and regulations of expenditure reduces, but potentially catastrophic value losers, as Grenfell Tower proved. Preventing predictable disasters can be outside the mindset or competence of many organizations. It's difficult to understand how we can accommodate that. Competent management systems integrate risk awareness, operate organizational memory, and effective resource utilization. Almost a motherhood statement. But the other important issue, as well as learning from inquiries, as long as complying with legal obligations, is to learn from public inquiries such as Grenfell and Concord, because they provide an valuable, cheap insight into predictable disasters. So why don't we use them? Thank you very much for spending time to watch and listen to this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. If people have questions, can you please put them into the chat box? Don't have any at the moment, but that's usually the case. It takes people a little while. So, Brian, can I sort of pose something to you? It seems to me that the increasing sophistication and automation of control systems that is now possible does create a new risk, because often the operators are do not understand how the control system is working, and therefore if things start to go wrong, they don't really know what is happening. And I would sort of mention the Boeing 737 MAX disasters, where a safety system effectively did something really peculiar when one sensor failed, and the pilots in most cases were unable to understand what was happening. I mean, do you see that as an ongoing risk?
Yes, I think the Federal Aviation Authority has seen that as a risk. Essentially, I think, well, as we're in a public discussion, I need to be careful about how I respond. But certainly looking at the Boeing catastrophe, the information that the pilots should have had, they didn't have. They were faced with a situation which they hadn't been trained to handle. Normally, pilots, when they fly the plane, are fairly familiar with what could go wrong. And they have checklists when things do go wrong, again, so that the discretion is limited. But you're right in terms of the situation. If there is a failure, one failure to disaster should not be present. So when any aircraft or any system is produced, then it needs to be checked that if it needs all its failure modes needs to be checked to make sure that a catastrophic disaster is not outside the competence of the people that are trying to prevent it.
Yeah, I mean, risk assessment is absolutely crucial on everything, and then a part of that is the appropriate training for those who will use the system.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem with any regulator, I could put it, the regulator doesn't always know where the skeletons are buried. Whereas the personnel working in the organization do know where the skeletons are buried. There's also a high risk if you, how could I put it, reveal a weakness that the company doesn't want revealed. I mean, you're controlled by confidentiality agreements and your contract of employment. But when you look at the Boeing situation, as I said, the FAA have looked closely at it, and there was a number of people that resigned from Boeing. I could put it. There were a number of people concerned about the situation, but if you work for a company, you have to be very careful, I could have put it, not to lose your job by agitating outside. I could have put it, by agitating too much. However, there is an employment law which says that you're entitled to object to work if you have the competence to know that what you've been asked to do is unsafe. One personally situation like that is during COVID. Councillors were asked to go back to meetings on rather than use Teams, and I personally objected to that on the basis that I wasn't confident enough that the local authority had the competence to make sure that the rooms were safe, such as monitoring the level of carbon dioxide in the room. I believe the safe level was 800 parts per million. So you raise an excellent point, Brian, and the engineers face a dilemma on how far they can go in terms of protecting their job to object to situations which they are uncomfortable with.
Right, we do have a question. Thank you very much for that. Right, I'll read it out for you, Brian. My experience is that senior management of an organisation often fails to recognise their responsibilities for directing and stewarding their business in terms of safety performance. How would you go about influencing change in the culture of safety management?
That is one of the key questions and key dilemmas I've faced. Part of the problem is accountability. There are very few large organizations that are prosecuted when fatalities occur, because it's very difficult to find out who's accountable. I was very interested in corporate manslaughter's laws. Britain seldom brings a corporate manslaughter, but when you have a corporate manslaughter charge, the answer is normally a fine, which is merely a punishment on shareholders and employees. The answer to the question is you work hard and try and influence people. In one organization I worked for, I was tasked with trying to get the management to test their water drench systems. There was a significant reluctance to do so. Yet after a number of memos, all of a sudden people started to test these deluge systems. And I couldn't understand why. Then I realized with the number of memos in place, people got about a little bit twitchy, that if the deluge systems didn't work and there was a fire, then accountability was, how could I put it, to some extent more, the exposure was more exposed. So it's a delicate situation, chip. The main thing is you need to try and do something. You cannot be blamed for doing the best that you can, but you can be blamed for doing nothing.
It's often another question. Can I just sort of make a point to you to follow up on that? As you mentioned, a lot of these inquiries are not looking to cast blame. They're looking to try and find out what happened, to learn, to try and prevent it happening in the future. And the
That's right.
problem is, if you have the inquiries focused on trying to find blame, it is likely to be less successful in identifying actions that you can take to prevent the similar things in the future. And
You're right.
it's a difficult balance to reach, isn't it?
Well, you're right, and that is one of the reasons. If you were to apportion blame, then you would almost have like a contest, and you're right, the information would not be revealed. To go back to my experience in Ark Royal, when the investigation into the fire was carried out, essentially everybody was given the assurance that no punishment would follow, because otherwise they wouldn't have found out what went wrong. Essentially, they found out that the fire, one of the burners had not been assembled correctly. It was an error that could be accepted.
Yeah. I think the next question actually picks up on the same point. Hasn't that accountability and prosecution for significant and inadequate safety measures changed with the CDM regulations?
CDM,
Construction design and management, which governs all sort of projects these days.
Well,
I mean, most prosecutions, they're not for corporate manslaughter, they're for failure to follow health and safety regulations is more normal these days.
I mean, are we referring to, I think it's the 2015 legislation, design and
No,
construction?
well, it's design and construction, but the CDM regulations are sort of define particular roles that have to be have nominated people or organisations for a significant project. And I'm not close to the detail these days, but a project with involving of a particular value or involving a number of people.
Well, as I said, the real problem with all legislation is unless it's enforced, it can be ignored unless the company culture is saying that they agree and abide by regulation. One of the ways of influencing the situation is to refer to the legal obligations. Well, essentially, going to law is expensive, and people try and take the easiest option. I mean, I'll give you an example. I complained about an environmental impact assessment locally, and I complained to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State essentially then just passes it to the civil servants who then respond. And I then questioned and asked him to reconsider because I thought the law had been misinterpreted. I then got a reply back from the housing, I believe the housing secretary, saying that if I wanted a legal opinion, I had to go to court. Well, I would have thought that the government would actually have given me an answer that had been checked legally correct.
Okay, are there any more questions? If there are not, and I don't see anyone typing a question, we'll draw to a close, but I'll give people a moment if there was anything wanted to. Key point that struck me was that organizational culture is key to safety, and being what is known as high reliability organization with a culture of prioritizing safety and constant improvement. And I think, sorry, what is being known as a high reliability organisation with a culture of prioritising safety and constant improvement. I think this is sort of suggesting what an organisation culture should aim at.
Yes, I mean, I worked in an organization where there was a high safety culture because of the organization nearly suffered a major disaster. So they become sensitive. But as you move away from the disaster, then organizations become less sensitive. However, some organizations carry out audits, management audits, and go into the units and essentially question their ability to manage. It's only if you carry out significant internal audits are you likely to find out if your organization is functioning as you believe it functions.
Okay,
I mean,
thank you.
to sort of add the final point, I used to carry out pre-contract audits and post-contract audits.
Okay, there is nothing else coming up, so I think we will draw to a close at that point. Um, Thank you very much, Brian. Really interesting. I think I share your view that sort of looking at the reports into some of these serious issues, uh, disasters that have occurred, is really valuable for the young engineer to understand the sort of things that might go wrong and to be constantly thinking about risks and how they can be mitigated. And, you know, anything new, what new risk does it pose? So I
Hmm.
think hopefully people have learnt that and will take it away tonight. So thank you very much indeed for an interesting talk. And thank you everyone for attending. As I say, we have recorded it and we'll try and get it on YouTube for everyone. So I am going to stop the recording. Which I have now done.